Margaret Winters flinched as the window frame rattled again from the gusty wind. May storms in Wisconsin were always unpredictable, but this one seemed particularly fierce. Rain drummed on the roof of her old lakeside house on Lake Windigo, like an angry guest demanding to be let in. She wrapped herself tighter in the cardigan that once belonged to Robert. "Another night alone," she murmured to the empty room, illuminated only by the warm glow of a table lamp and occasional flashes of lightning. Suddenly, a loud thud from the backyard made her jump. Margaret cautiously approached the window and squinted, peering into the darkness between lightning flashes. Something white was moving in the tall grass near the lakeshore. Her heart quickened. Something or someone was out there. With a flashlight in one hand and Robert's old baseball bat in the other, she carefully opened the back door. The rain instantly soaked her gray hair, and the wind cut through to her bones. Margaret moved slowly toward the white spot that was faintly visible in the darkness. "Oh my God!" she gasped when the flashlight beam illuminated it. A large white swan lay on its side, its magnificent wings partially unfurled, one of them appearing unnaturally twisted. A dark stain on the white feathers resembled blood. The swan raised its head when her light fell upon it. Its black eyes met her gaze. There was pain in them, and as it seemed to her, a plea. "Easy, beautiful," Margaret said, lowering the bat and slowly approaching. "I won't hurt you." The bird tried to crawl away, but only let out a pitiful cry. Margaret's heart clenched at the sound. During 15 years of solitary life after Robert's death, she had learned to hide her emotions, keep her distance. But something about the helplessness of this majestic creature broke through her defenses. Without hesitating any longer, she took off her cardigan and carefully draped it over the trembling bird, trying not to touch the injured wing. The swan was heavy, much heavier than she expected, but adrenaline gave her strength. Supporting its body and head, she slowly carried it to the house. "You're nothing compared to Robert when I had to drag him after that stroke," she muttered, partly to the bird, partly to herself. In the house, she set up an improvised nest of old towels in a large laundry basket and carefully placed the swan there. The bird looked exhausted, but still cautiously watched her. Margaret examined the injured wing, a clear wound from something sharp, possibly a hook or wire, and seemingly bruised or even broken. She felt she was much less afraid than she should be. Perhaps years of solitude had dulled her self-preservation instincts, or perhaps she had just been waiting too long to care for someone again. "Now I need to clean this wound, and then we'll call the vet in the morning," she said, filling a bowl with warm water. "Though I'm not sure if Dr. Peterson has ever treated swans." The swan allowed her to gently clean the wound, only occasionally flinching. She wasn't sure, but its trust seemed strange for a wild animal. "You don't seem like the other swans on the lake," she remarked, washing away the last traces of dirt from the wound. "They're usually aggressive, but it's like you know I'm trying to help." Margaret shook her head, realizing she was talking to the bird as if it could understand her. "Look what loneliness has done to me." Talking to a bird. After she finished cleaning the wound and applied a light bandage, avoiding wrapping it too tightly, Margaret sat beside her unexpected guest and gazed at him for a long time. Something about his presence, a strange mixture of majesty and vulnerability, resonated in her soul. "I'll call you Swan," she said, knowing it was banal to name a swan the English word for swan, but having no other ideas. "You'll stay here until you recover." The swan settled more comfortably in the improvised nest, tucking its head under its uninjured wing, apparently deciding that Margaret posed no threat. That night, she slept on the sofa next to the swan's basket, waking every hour to check on him. And for the first time in many years, she didn't feel completely alone. The next morning, bright sunshine woke her. The storm had subsided as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a shining, rain-washed world. For a moment, Margaret stared in confusion at the basket with the white bird, almost deciding it had been just a strange dream. She cautiously approached the swan. "Good morning, Swan. How's your wing today?" The bird raised its head, stretched its uninjured wing, and made a soft sound that she interpreted as a greeting. Margaret smiled, feeling a joy that surprised her with its intensity. "I think we need to find you more suitable accommodations," she said, examining her guest. "And some food. What do swans eat?" "Bread won't do, that I know." Her thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. Her grandson Michael's name lit up on the screen. "Grandma?" She heard his voice when she picked up. "Are you okay after yesterday's storm?" "Yes, dear. Everything's fine," she replied, not mentioning her new guest. "Listen, I have news," Michael continued after a brief pause. "My summer plans have changed. The internship was canceled, and well, I was thinking maybe I could spend the summer at your lake house. I know it's unexpected." Margaret froze, feeling a mixture of joy and anxiety. Michael, her only grandson, the son of her late daughter, was practically a stranger. For the past few years, they had only seen each other at Christmas, and even then, their conversations were strained, filled with awkward pauses. After Catherine's death, their relationship had become formal. Phone calls on birthdays, occasional text messages. She glanced at the swan, who was watching her, tilting his head to one side as if he could sense her distress. "Grandma, are you still there?" Michael's voice brought her back to the conversation. "Yes, of course, you can come," she said, surprised by her own words. "When do you plan to arrive?" "If it's not a problem, tomorrow? I have a ticket for a bus to Madison, and from there I could take a taxi." "Tomorrow," she repeated, looking at the swan. "All right, I'll prepare your room." After ending the call, Margaret stood by the window gazing at the calm surface of the lake. Her quiet, predictable life had suddenly filled with unexpected guests, an injured swan and an almost stranger grandson. After years of solitude and routine, the changes seemed both frightening and invigorating. "Well, Swan," she said, turning back to the bird, "looks like we're in for an interesting summer." The swan made a soft sound and spread its healthy wing as if agreeing. Margaret woke up before dawn. She couldn't remember when she had last felt such excitement. Whether because of her grandson, who was to arrive after noon, or because of the swan sleeping in an adapted enclosure on the back porch. Yesterday, late in the evening, she had managed to call Dr. Peterson, the local veterinarian. "A swan, you say?" He sounded surprised, but not shocked. "Yes, I can stop by after my morning appointments. Keep him calm and continue to keep him hydrated." She quietly approached the back door and peered through the screen. Swan was in place, his white feathers glistening in the first rays of light. Meeting her gaze, he made a soft sound, almost like a greeting. "Good morning to you too," Margaret whispered, opening the door. "I hope your wing feels better." She couldn't understand why she had become so attached to this bird so quickly. Perhaps years of solitude had broken the dam of her emotions. Or perhaps something in the dignified demeanor of the swan resonated with her own stoic nature. While Margaret prepared breakfast, eggs with ham for herself and chopped vegetables for Swan, according to advice she found in an old bird guide, her thoughts returned to Michael. What did she really know about her grandson? He had turned 17 last December. He liked video games and music. Beyond that, not much. After Catherine's death 5 years ago, her connection with her grandson had gradually weakened. Her son-in-law, David, had subsequently remarried, and the new family dynamic seemed to leave little room for a grandmother from upstate. Phone calls became shorter, visits less frequent. "Will I be able to find common ground with a teenager?" she asked Swan, who was watching her from the porch. "God knows, I wasn't the best mother to Catherine." The Swan tilted his head as if pondering her words. Margaret spent the second half of the morning preparing the room for Michael. She changed the bedding, dusted the shelves and desk, and even put a few fresh wildflowers in a vase before deciding it was probably too much. A teenage boy would hardly appreciate such a gesture. Dr. Peterson arrived around 11, his worn pickup raising clouds of dust on the gravel driveway. After curiously examining Swan, he carefully inspected the wing. "You're in luck, Mrs. Winters. It's not a fracture, just a severe sprain and a superficial wound," he said, adjusting his glasses on his nose. "With proper care, he should make a full recovery in 3 to 4 weeks. "So I can keep him here?" asked Margaret, feeling relief that surprised her with its intensity. "This is a mute swan, if I'm not mistaken," continued the veterinarian, examining the bird's beak, "a non-native species, possibly escaped from private ownership. I would recommend contacting the wildlife department, but," he smiled, noticing her worried expression, "I think you're doing an excellent job. If you want to care for him, it's certainly medically appropriate." As Dr. Peterson drove away, leaving her with antibiotics and care instructions, Margaret felt a strange elation. She had a purpose, a reason to get up in the morning. She didn't mention it to the veterinarian, but last night she found that her arthritis was bothering her less than usual. Perhaps tending to the Swan had distracted her from her own pain. Only when she finished preparing a light lunch, grilled chicken and salad, did Margaret hear the sound of a taxi pulling up. Her heart beat faster. She smoothed her dress, fixed her hair, and took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "Just a grandson," she reminded herself. "Not a stranger. Blood of your blood." But when she opened the front door, Margaret could barely conceal her surprise. The teenager standing on the porch with a backpack and guitar case seemed taller and older than she remembered from Christmas. His dark hair was longer than David's, and his eyes, the same bright blue as Catherine's, looked at her with an indeterminate expression. "Hi, Grandma," he said, smiling hesitantly. "Michael." She wanted to hug him, but instead awkwardly shook his hand. "Come in. You must be hungry after your trip." The boy seemed to relax. Starving, honestly. Conversation during lunch didn't flow easily. Margaret asked about school. Michael answered in monosyllables. She asked about his father and stepmother. He shrugged. Only when she asked about the guitar did his eyes light up. "I play in a band," he said, immediately becoming more talkative. "Indie rock, mostly. I write most of the songs." "Just like your mother," Margaret blurted out before she could stop herself. Michael froze, his fork suspended above his plate. "Mom wrote songs?" "Of course. She always composed beautiful melodies. She had an incredible voice." Margaret hesitated, wondering how much David had told Michael about his mother. "You didn't know?" The boy shook his head, and something in his gaze squeezed her heart. "Dad doesn't talk about her much. Jessica, my stepmother, thinks it only upsets everyone." Margaret clenched her napkin under the table. 5 years, and Catherine was already becoming a ghost, erased from the memory of her own family. "I have her recordings," she said quietly, "if you want to listen." Something flashed in Michael's eyes, a vulnerability that reminded Margaret of Swan's wary caution. "I'd like that," he said simply. The morning tension slowly subsided, and after lunch, having shown Michael his room, Margaret decided to introduce him to the other guest. "We had another visitor the other day," she said, leading him to the back door. "He was injured during the storm." "Who?" Michael began, but his words trailed off when he saw the swan. "That's a swan? A real swan?" There was genuine amazement in his voice. "His name is Swan," said Margaret, feeling a strange pride when her grandson stared at the bird with his mouth open. Not very original, I know. The swan seemed to be examining the new visitor with equal interest. He stretched his neck and tilted his head slightly, as if trying to get a better look at the boy. "Can I pet him?" asked Michael, surprising Margaret with his boldness. "I wouldn't recommend it. He's still wild, and swans can be aggressive, although this one is behaving remarkably well." Michael knelt down a few feet away from Swan. "Hi," he said softly. "I'm Michael." To Margaret's great surprise, the swan extended his long neck forward, gently touching Michael's hand with his beak. The boy laughed, a genuine, happy sound that Margaret suddenly realized she hadn't heard in a very long time. "I think he likes me," said Michael, carefully reaching out to gently stroke the bird's head. "Careful with the wing," warned Margaret, but her concern was replaced by amazement. Swan, who had kept her at a respectful distance, was allowing Michael to pet him like a house cat. "What happened to him?" asked Michael. Margaret told about the storm and the rescue. When she finished, Michael was thoughtfully looking at the swan. "It's strange that he was alone. Swans usually mate for life." "How do you know that?" Margaret asked, impressed. Michael shrugged. "Biology classes, and I do a bit of bird watching. One of the best biologists at our school is a bird watcher." Margaret felt something warm spreading in her chest, a small ray of connection. "Unexpected and precious. Your grandfather also went bird watching," she said. "I still have his binoculars." Michael looked at her with undisguised interest. "Really? Can I see them?" "Of course," she replied, suddenly feeling that this summer might not be as difficult as she had feared. "And maybe you could help me take care of our guest while his wing heals." When they returned to the house, Margaret noticed Swan watching them with his intelligent black eyes. For the first time in many years, she felt that her lonely house on the lakeshore was filling with life. And all three seemed to find comfort in this. A week had passed since Michael's arrival, and Margaret's life had taken on a new, unexpected rhythm. Every morning, she woke up before dawn and prepared breakfast while her grandson was still sleeping. Then together, they cared for Swan, whose wing was slowly but surely healing. "Look, Grandma, he can raise it a little now," Michael pointed out one morning when the swan carefully extended his injured wing. Margaret smiled, watching their interaction. Something about the relationship between the boy and the bird touched her heart. Was it the similarity of their fates? Both had lost something important. Both had been torn from their familiar environments. "By the way, I found something yesterday," said Michael, pulling a small shiny object from his jeans pocket. "It was in the grass near the spot where you found Swan." Margaret took the item and examined it closely. It was a small metal cylinder, similar to a bullet casing, but strangely modified with holes along the sides. "Looks like a casing," she said, frowning. "But I haven't seen any hunters here. Hunting season hasn't opened yet." "It's not an ordinary cartridge." Michael took back the object and examined it carefully. It looks more like a tranquilizer or marking round used by wildlife researchers. Margaret pondered. You think Swan might have been shot deliberately? Maybe, Michael shrugged. Or he could have been an accidental victim. What concerns me more is why someone would be shooting at birds on a private lake. This question remained unanswered throughout the morning as they went about their household chores. After lunch, when Michael went to play guitar on the dock, Margaret decided to call her longtime neighbor and friend, Eleanor Johnson, who lived on the opposite shore of the lake. Marking rounds? On Wendigo? Eleanor sounded concerned. No, there haven't been any official studies here for several years. But what? Margaret prompted when her friend fell silent. It might be related to the new developments. You've heard about the construction plan, haven't you? Lakeside Investments bought a significant portion of the North Shore. They say they're planning to build a resort complex there. Margaret felt her heart tighten. The North Shore of Lake Wendigo had always been a protected area, home to numerous bird species and other wildlife. It was Robert's favorite spot for birdwatching. When did this happen? Who sold them the land? Eleanor sighed. Most owners sold their plots last year. You know how the economic situation forced many to look for additional funds. But not everyone agreed. The Green family is still holding onto their plot, and rumors say the company isn't too pleased about it. After the conversation with Eleanor, Margaret stood by the window, looking at the calm surface of the lake. The waters sparkled in the sun like scattered diamonds. Could someone really destroy this beauty for the sake of a resort? Her thoughts were interrupted by Michael, who burst into the house, his face red with excitement. "Grandma, you have to see this!" he exclaimed, barely catching his breath. On the North Shore, near the big pine grove, there are some vehicles and people with equipment. Margaret took Robert's binoculars, and together with Michael, they went to the dock. Through the powerful lenses, she indeed saw several vehicles and people in corporate uniforms setting up instruments along the shoreline. "What are they doing there?" asked Michael. "I'm not sure," replied Margaret, but a strange feeling of unease troubled her. But it seems to be related to the plans to develop the lake. She told her grandson what she had learned from Eleanor. Michael listened with growing concern. "But the North Shore is a waterfowl sanctuary," he said. "Rare species nest there. And it used to be your grandfather's favorite observation point," added Margaret. She hesitated before continuing. "Michael, do you think this might be connected to Swan's injury?" The boy thoughtfully looked at the opposite shore. "If they're doing an environmental assessment for construction, they need to prove there are no rare or protected species there. And a mute swan, though not native, could still create problems for their plans. Especially if it's nesting here," Margaret finished for him. That evening, as they dined on the veranda, Swan was strangely restless. He frequently turned his head toward the North Shore and made quiet, almost mournful sounds. "He senses something," said Michael, watching the bird. "Do you think he might have had a nest there? Maybe even a mate?" "Swans do form pairs for life," Margaret said thoughtfully. "If he has a partner, she's probably still looking for him." This thought troubled her all evening. When Michael went to bed, Margaret sat on the porch, looking at the moon reflected in the dark waters of the lake. Swan lay nearby, still restless. "What can we do?" she whispered to the quiet night. The next morning, the solution came unexpectedly. At breakfast, Michael suggested taking the boat to the North Shore and exploring the area. "It's private property," Margaret reminded him. "We can't just land there." "We don't have to go ashore," the boy replied, his eyes shining with an adventurous spirit. "We can look from the water. If there's swan's nest or other rare birds, we should know." Margaret hesitated. Part of her, the sensible, cautious woman she had become after Robert's death wanted to say no. But another part, which was feeling alive again since Michael's arrival, desired action. "All right," she finally said, "but we'll be careful. We'll take Robert's old canoe. It's less noticeable than the motorboat." Michael broke into a smile that reminded her of Catherine in her youth. "You're the best grandma in the world." They set out later that morning, when the fog over the lake began to dissipate. The old canoe glided across the water almost silently. Margaret paddled at the stern, while Michael was at the bow, watching for birds through his grandfather's binoculars. They left Swan safely on the back porch, but he watched their departure with visible agitation, stretching his neck in the direction of the North Shore. As they approached the protected area, Michael suddenly signaled to stop. "Look," he whispered, passing the binoculars to Margaret. "There, among the reeds." Through the lenses, she saw what her grandson had noticed. Among the tall reed stems appeared the majestic white figure of another mute swan. "A second swan!" she gasped. "Do you think—" "It must be Swan's mate," Michael nodded, his voice trembling with excitement. "And look over there, to the right!" Margaret redirected the binoculars in the indicated direction and froze. Among the dense reeds, a large nest was visible, and in it, 3 grayish eggs. "Oh my God," she whispered. "They have babies, or at least they will soon." They carefully paddled closer, trying not to startle the other swan. The bird, however, seemed too busy to notice them. It swam nervously near the nest, occasionally making sad sounds, so similar to those made by Swan. "She's looking for him," Michael said quietly. "She doesn't know where he is." Margaret felt tears filling her eyes. "We have to return Swan here as soon as he can fly." "But what if the developers destroy this area by then?" Michael looked at his grandmother with concern. "We have to do something." At that moment, their conversation was interrupted by the sharp sound of a motor. Looking back, they saw a small motorboat with the Lakeside Investments logo approaching them. There were 2 men in corporate uniforms on board. "Hey, you," one of them called out. "This is private property. You have no right to be here." Margaret straightened up, feeling a long-forgotten fire of determination igniting in her chest. "Actually, this is a waterfowl sanctuary," she replied loudly and clearly. "And it appears that rare species are nesting here." The men exchanged glances, clearly displeased with this encounter. "Margaret Winters?" one finally said, looking more closely at her. "We've been trying to contact you. You're one of the last owners who hasn't sold their property." "And I don't intend to," she shot back, suddenly realizing that she was standing on the threshold of a battle for something much bigger than the fate of one swan. "Mrs. Winters, be reasonable," the man in the motorboat tried to sound persuasive. "Our offer is more than generous. Property values in this area have never been higher." Margaret felt her hands grip the paddle tighter. "My answer is no, and it will never be otherwise." "Grandma," Michael said quietly, noticing how tense the situation had become, "maybe we should head back." The men in the boat exchanged glances. The one at the helm, younger, with cropped hair and cold eyes, leaned toward the other and whispered something. The older one, with an expensive watch and tan skin, nodded. "Remember that this is private property," he said, pointing to the shore. "You must leave this area immediately." "Actually, no," Michael suddenly replied, his voice sounding surprisingly confident for a teenager. "According to federal waterfowl protection law, nesting territories of protected species cannot be completely closed to public access. especially for scientific observations. Margaret looked at her grandson in surprise. Was he bluffing, or did he really know the law? However, the effect was immediate. The smile disappeared from the older man's face. Besides, Michael continued, pulling out his phone, I just photographed a mute swan with a nest. The State Department of Fish and Wildlife would probably be interested in this fact, especially considering the tranquilizer casing found yesterday. A tense silence fell. Finally, the older man nodded. Of course, we support environmental initiatives. Our project fully complies with all environmental protection requirements. He handed Margaret a business card. Keith Anderson, CEO of Lakeside Investments. If you change your mind about selling, let me know. Let's go, James. When the boat moved away, Margaret turned to her grandson. That was impressive. Do you really know about this law? Michael laughed, suddenly becoming a teenager again. I was completely bluffing, but it sounded convincing, didn't it? On the way back, they discussed their findings and what to do next. Margaret felt a mixture of fear and determination. This was not just about saving a swan. It was a fight for her home, for the lake, for Robert's and Catherine's legacy. When they approached their dock, they were met with an unexpected sight. Swan was standing at the edge of the dock, his healthy wing fully extended and his injured one carefully stretched out. He was looking toward the north shore with visible agitation. He senses it, Michael said quietly. He knows we've seen his family. That day during lunch, they formulated a plan. They decided to contact other owners around the lake who had not yet sold their plots, as well as reach out to the local conservation organization. Michael suggested posting photos of the nest and swans on social media to draw public attention. And I'll call the Greens, added Margaret, remembering the neighbors who were still resisting the developer's pressure. John Green used to teach ecology at the college. He might know more about the legal aspects. That evening, while Michael worked on social media posts, Margaret browsed through Robert's old bird albums. In one of them, she found a record of sightings of a pair of mute swans on the lake 5 years ago. Michael, look, she called to her grandson. Your grandfather saw these swans before. Listen, observed 2 mute swans on the North Shore, extremely rare for this region, possibly escaped from private ownership or released by an unknown person. Beautiful and proud birds. We'll observe them next season. Michael listened attentively, his eyes widening. Grandpa knew about them. This means these swans have been living here for several years. This strengthens our arguments. Margaret nodded. If they've been nesting here for 5 years, they're no longer casual visitors. The next morning, the first results of their activity arrived. Eleanor Johnson and 2 other neighbors came to Margaret's porch, expressing their support. The company is putting pressure on all of us, said Tom Craig, a retiree whose property was a bit further down the shore. But after Michael posted those photos, they've slowed down a bit. Seems they don't want bad press coverage. Sometimes, publicity is our best weapon, agreed Eleanor. By the way, I've contacted several local journalists. They're interested in the story. By lunchtime, about a dozen people had gathered in Margaret's yard. Neighbors, representatives of local environmental groups, and even a journalist from the district newspaper. Unexpectedly, Margaret found herself at the center of an impromptu meeting. We need to act together, she said, feeling a confidence that surprised herself. If the resort is built, it will forever change the lake's ecosystem. But they already have permits, someone in the crowd noted. Not all of them, replied a new voice. Margaret turned and saw John Green, a tall, gray-haired man with a tanned face. Their environmental assessment is still in question, and if we prove that rare species are nesting here, the process could drag on for years. The conversation became more animated. People discussed strategies, shared contacts, formed committees. Margaret watched as her quiet homestead transformed into a resistance headquarters. She noticed that Michael was actively communicating with a group of younger people, ecology students that John had brought. Suddenly she saw Swan, who stood apart from the crowd but was watching the events attentively. There was something amazingly regal in his posture, as if he understood that all these people had gathered here partly because of him. Toward evening, when most guests had left, leaving only a few key activists for further planning, Margaret was finally able to rest on the porch. Michael sat down beside her, his face glowing with excitement. "This is just incredible, Grandma," he said. "You united all these people." "Not just me," she replied, squeezing his hand. "Us together, and Swan too." She nodded toward the swan, who was now peacefully resting on the shore. "You know," Michael said thoughtfully, "Dad always said you were too stubborn. Now I understand that it can be a wonderful trait." Margaret laughed, feeling warmth spreading in her chest. "Your mother had the same temperament. I remember how she organized an entire campaign to save the old theater in our town from demolition. She was incredibly persistent when she believed in something." "Tell me more," Michael asked, and Margaret saw something new in his eyes, a hunger to learn about the mother he had been deprived of too early. They talked late into the night, remembering Catherine. Margaret retrieved old photo albums, letters, even cassettes with recordings of her daughter's songs. For the first time in many years, she felt that the connection lost after Catherine's death was beginning to be restored. "She would be proud of you," Margaret said when Michael finally prepared to go to bed. "Of your music, your passion for nature, everything that you are." Michael hugged her, the first real hug since he arrived. "I think she would be proud of both of us." The next morning, they were awakened by the sound of a car. Looking out the window, Margaret saw a black sedan with the Lakeside Investments logo. Keith Anderson got out of the car, accompanied by another man in a business suit. "It seems our fight has caught their attention," she said to Michael, who came and stood beside her. "They look not very happy," he replied, watching as the visitors headed toward the house. Margaret took a deep breath, preparing for the confrontation. "You know, I used to be afraid of conflicts. After Robert's death and then Catherine's, it seemed easier to hide from the world. And now?" asked Michael, looking at her. She smiled, feeling a strange mixture of calm and determination filling her. "Now I understand that some things are worth fighting for. Your mother knew this, and I think it's time for me to remember it again." She went out onto the porch to meet the unwelcome guests, with Michael confidently beside her, and Swan, as if sensing the tension, took up a position nearby, his neck proudly erect, his gaze alert. Together they formed an unwavering front, an elderly woman, a teenager, and an injured swan, ready to defend their home and the wildlife of Lake Windigo. "Mrs. Winters," Keith Anderson forced a smile as he climbed onto the porch. "I see you've activated your social life here." "Mr. Anderson," Margaret nodded, deliberately not inviting him into the house. "If you've come with a new offer, my answer remains unchanged." The man in the suit next to Anderson cleared his throat. "Allow me to introduce myself. David Clark, Chief Legal Counsel for Lakeside Investments." He extended his hand, which Margaret ignored. "Mrs. Winters, you're spreading false information about our project," Anderson continued, his tone becoming harsher. "Your grandson's publications and yesterday's impromptu meeting are interfering with legitimate business activities. We might consider filing a lawsuit." Michael stepped forward, but Margaret gently moved him aside. "We have nothing to fear from the truth, Mr. Anderson. And the truth is that your project threatens the unique ecosystem of this lake." "We comply with all environmental standards," Clark interjected. "Our experts conducted a detailed study." "And somehow missed the nesting of mute swans?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Quite an interesting coincidence." Speaking of which, Anderson changed tactics, his voice becoming almost friendly. "We would like to examine the bird you're keeping. If it's injured, it needs professional care. We're ready to arrange transportation to a specialized rehabilitation center." Swan, as if understanding that the conversation concerned him, extended his healthy wing in a protective gesture. Michael instantly stood in front of him. "It's strange that you're so concerned about his condition when it was probably your people who injured him," the boy said with undisguised hostility. "Jim, you've arrived just in time," Margaret said with relief. "Mr. Anderson was just expressing concern about Swan's condition." The veterinarian approached the group, assessing the situation with a professional eye. "Keith Anderson, we met at the city council meeting last month." "Dr. Peterson," Anderson nodded, "we were just expressing concern about a wild bird being kept in unsuitable conditions." "Unsuitable?" The veterinarian raised his eyebrows in surprise. "I personally oversee the treatment of this swan. The care Mrs. Winters provides is excellent. In fact, his condition has improved significantly since she rescued him." "Rescued?" Clark interrupted. "We have information that the bird was illegally captured from its natural habitat." "Illegally captured?" Margaret was indignant. "I found him injured during a storm, an injury that suspiciously resembles the result of a tranquilizer dart." Dr. Peterson frowned. "Show me that swan again." They all approached Swan, who calmly allowed the veterinarian to examine his wing. "Yes, the wound is healing well," said the doctor, carefully examining the injury. "But I agree with Margaret. This looks very much like an injury from a marking dart. Here, you can see the characteristic mark. And we found the casing near the place where Grandma rescued him," added Michael, pulling the metal cylinder from his pocket and holding it out to the veterinarian. Dr. Peterson examined the object and slowly nodded. "This is undoubtedly a casing from a marking round. I've seen these when I worked with wildlife research teams." "So someone deliberately injured Swan?" asked Margaret, feeling her anger rising. "Looks that way," confirmed the veterinarian. "The only question is, who and why?" All eyes turned to the Lakeside Investments representatives. Anderson remained impassive, but Clark began nervously adjusting his tie. "These are absurd insinuations," Anderson finally said. "Our company has no relation to the injury of a wild bird." "Then you won't object to an official investigation?" Margaret calmly asked. "I've already contacted the State Department of Conservation. They were very interested in the nesting of mute swans and the possible case of poaching." For a moment, Anderson lost his confidence. "Listen, Mrs. Winters, let's be reasonable. Our project will bring economic growth to the entire region. New jobs, tourists, increased property values." "At the cost of destroying nature," Michael interrupted him. "You saw that rare birds were nesting there and decided to simply get rid of them so they wouldn't interfere with your project." "We don't have evidence of their involvement," cautioned Dr. Peterson. "But we can find it," replied Michael, taking out his phone. "I took a few more photos yesterday when we were on the North Shore. Look." He showed the images. They depicted the female swan near the nest, and in the background, several people in company uniforms were setting up some equipment. "This is company property. We have the right to conduct work there," Clark quickly said. "And this?" Michael scrolled to the next photo, where one of the workers was holding what looked like a tranquilizer gun. Anderson and Clark exchanged quick glances. Our employees have standard equipment for safely handling wildlife, Anderson tried to explain. This is standard procedure for ecological studies. What kind of studies exactly? Asked Dr. Peterson. First of all, any interventions with wild animals require special permits. The conversation was interrupted by the loud sound of car engines. Several more vehicles entered the yard. From the first minivan emerged a woman with a camera and microphone, a reporter from local television. She was followed by two people in State Department of Conservation uniforms. "What's happening?" whispered Michael, excitedly looking at his grandmother. "Eleanor," Margaret smiled. "She promised to contact the press." One of the department representatives, a portly man with a badge reading R. Thompson, approached the group. "Margaret Winters?" he asked. "We received your report regarding a possible violation of bird protection laws and illegal use of tranquilizers." "You've arrived just in time," she replied. "Dr. Peterson has just confirmed that the Swan was injured by a marking dart, and my grandson discovered the nesting site on the north shore of the lake." The reporter was already preparing her camera, and Anderson looked increasingly irritated. "We will gladly cooperate with any investigation," he said with a forced smile. "Lakeside Investments always adheres to the highest environmental standards." "Excellent," Thompson nodded. "Then you won't object to an immediate inspection of your facilities on the North Shore. We have a warrant." Clark paled. "A warrant? But on what grounds?" "Complaint about illegal use of tranquilizer firearms without proper permits and possible violation of wild bird protection laws," replied the second inspector, a young woman with a serious face. "We have sufficient grounds for a search." Michael couldn't hide a wide smile. Margaret felt something warming in her chest, a mixture of pride in her grandson, triumph at seeing the confused faces of the company representatives, and most importantly, a feeling that she was once again fighting for something important. "Mr. Anderson," she said, when the inspectors had taken the corporate representatives aside for questioning, "you mentioned economic benefits, but there are things more valuable than money. This lake, these birds, this home, they're all part of a legacy I want to leave to my grandson and his generation." Swan, as if understanding the importance of the moment, took several graceful steps forward and unfurled his healthy wing, displaying his magnificent white plumage. The injured wing also rose slightly, showing evident progress in healing. "He's recovering," Michael said quietly, standing next to his grandmother. "Soon he'll be able to return to his family." Margaret embraced her grandson's shoulders, watching as the inspectors got into their cars, escorting the Lakeside Investments representatives. The reporter approached them with a microphone, ready to conduct an interview. "Are you ready to become a TV star?" Margaret joked. "Only if you're beside me," Michael replied, squeezing her hand. Under the rays of the afternoon sun, three silhouettes of an elderly woman, a teenager, and a majestic white swan were clearly outlined against the backdrop of the shimmering lake, forming a picture of unexpected but unwavering unity. 3 weeks after the confrontation with the Lakeside Investments representatives flew by in a whirlwind of events. The story about the mute swans and the local residents' fight against the Lake Wendigo development was broadcast not only on local channels, but also on national ones. Environmental organizations came out in support of the lake's defenders, and several well-known conservationists even visited Margaret's house. "Are you sure you're ready for today?" Michael asked as they ate breakfast on the veranda. The day promised to be warm and sunny, perfect for the planned event. Margaret looked at Swan, who was cleaning his feathers near the water. Over these weeks, his wing had completely healed, and for the past few days, he had been trying to fly. First, uncertainly, then, with increasing strength and grace. "It's time for him to return to his family," she replied, feeling a mixture of joy and sadness. Dr. Peterson said he's fully recovered. Proof of this came moments later when Swan widely spread both wings and took flight over the water, making a small circle above the garden before landing again. Michael excitedly pointed to this spectacle. "Look, he's absolutely ready." Margaret nodded, trying to hide her sadness. Over these weeks, the swan had become part of their lives. She knew his place was with his mate and future cygnets, but his absence would still leave a void. At noon, Margaret's yard was again filled with people. There were not only neighbors and environmental activists, but also reporters, representatives of the Department of Conservation, and even several families with children who had come to see the famous swan. "I never suspected this would turn into such a public event," Margaret whispered to Eleanor, watching the crowd. "It's more than just a swan, Margaret," her friend replied. "It's a symbol of community victory over corporate greed. Did you know that Lakeside Investments withdrew their construction application? They announced it yesterday." "What?" Margaret couldn't hide her surprise. "They gave up on the project?" "Completely," confirmed Eleanor. "The investigation uncovered serious violations, falsification of environmental reports, illegal use of tranquilizers, even bribery of some local officials. Their reputation is destroyed." Margaret glanced at Michael, who was chatting with a group of young people, students from the environmental club of a neighboring college. Over these weeks, her grandson had blossomed, finding new friends and shared interests. She no longer saw in him the uncertain teenager who had arrived at the beginning of summer. "Time," announced Dr. Peterson, approaching Margaret. "Swan is ready, and the weather is perfect. Besides, we want him to have enough time to reunite with his family before evening." They gathered a small group: Margaret, Michael, Dr. Peterson, and 2 representatives from the Department of Conservation, to accompany Swan by boat to the North Shore. The rest of the observers remained on the shore near Margaret's house, or positioned themselves on other boats at a safe distance. When Margaret approached Swan, the bird bowed his head as if in acknowledgement. She gently stroked his neck, feeling tears filling her eyes. "Time to go home, beautiful," she whispered. Michael carefully helped transfer the swan to the boat. Surprisingly, the bird didn't protest, as if understanding they were doing this for his benefit. As the boat drifted away from shore, Margaret looked back at her house. How many years had she lived there in solitude, shut off from the world after so many losses? Now her home was again filled with life, voices, hustle, and bustle. And all thanks to an injured bird that appeared on that stormy night. "What are you thinking about?" asked Michael, noticing her thoughtfulness. "About how one event can change everything," she replied. "If it weren't for Swan, you and I might have spent the summer as strangers under one roof." Michael nodded, his eyes also filling with emotion. "I know, and if it weren't for him, I wouldn't have learned so much about Mom, wouldn't have heard her music, wouldn't have found my place here." When the boat approached the North Shore, they saw the second swan, Swan's mate, gracefully swimming near the nest, carefully guarding her eggs. "Look, she's noticed him!" exclaimed Dr. Peterson. The female swan abruptly raised her head, making a joyful sound. Swan responded with a similar call, and suddenly, not waiting for the boat to get closer to shore, he spread his wings and took flight, rising above the water in a powerful ascent. "Amazing," whispered Margaret, watching as the snow-white bird circled above the lake, then landed next to his mate. Their reunion was touching. The swans intertwined their long necks in a kind of embrace, making soft sounds similar to purring. "Here, take this." Michael handed his grandmother the binoculars, wiping away his own tears. "Look at them closer." Through the lenses, she watched as Swan approached the nest, carefully examining the eggs before gently settling next to the female, protecting his reunited family. "A few days, and the cygnets will hatch," said one of the department representatives. "Now that this area has received the status of a special conservation zone, they'll be safe." Margaret lowered the binoculars, feeling something letting go in her heart. They'll be wonderful parents. On the way back, she sat silently, allowing Michael to talk the whole time with the department representatives about the Swan monitoring program they planned to launch. Her grandson had decided to join the Wildlife Conservation Volunteer Service and had already arranged for an internship during his fall break. When they returned to shore, a surprise awaited them. A tall, middle-aged man stood on Margaret's porch. "Dad?" Michael exclaimed in surprise as they approached the house. David, Michael's father, awkwardly shifted from foot to foot. "Hi, son. Margaret." "David," she nodded, feeling herself tensing. They hadn't spoken properly since Catherine's funeral. "I saw the report on TV," he explained, "about the swans and the development. It seemed I had to come." Michael looked at his grandmother, as if searching for a hint on how to react. Margaret took a deep breath, remembering everything she had learned this summer about second chances. "You're just in time for dinner," she said simply, "and Michael has a lot to tell you." That evening, the three of them sat on the veranda, watching as the sun slowly set over Lake Windigo. The conversation didn't flow easily, with difficult moments and long pauses. But for the first time in 5 years, they talked about Catherine, her music, her laughter, her love for nature that Michael had inherited. "She always loved this lake," said David, looking at the water. "I remember how she said she found peace here." "As did Robert," Margaret replied quietly. "Now I understand why they both loved this place so much. There's something healing about it." Michael, who was reviewing his swan photos on his phone, suddenly looked up. "You know what? We should name them. Not just Swan, but something special." "And what do you suggest?" asked Margaret. "Robert and Catherine," he replied simply, "in honor of Grandpa and Mom. They were also a pair for life, weren't they?" David turned away, but Margaret noticed him wiping his eyes. She herself felt something warming deep in her soul. "Yes," she said, touching her grandson's hand. "They would understand the symbolism." Later, when David and Michael were talking on the porch, Margaret went to her study and retrieved an old photograph, herself with Robert, young and happy, holding newborn Catherine in their arms. Next to it, she placed a new photo that Michael had taken today. 2 swans, their necks intertwined in the shape of a heart with the shimmering lake in the background. "Wings of healing," she whispered, looking at both photos. "I finally understand what you meant, Robert." Through the window, she could see Michael animatedly talking with his father, showing him something on his phone. This was just the beginning. Complete restoration of family ties wouldn't happen in one evening. But they had taken the first step. On the north shore of the lake, the Swan family was preparing for the night. 2 majestic birds guarding their nest, their white silhouettes clearly visible against the darkening sky. And in Margaret's house, once quiet and lonely, voices and laughter rang out again. Bonds broken by grief began to slowly heal, like Swan's injured wing. Margaret realized that sometimes the most unexpected helpers bring the greatest healing. Sometimes you need to lose something to understand what truly matters. And sometimes, when you save someone else, the greatest healing comes to yourself.